Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, whatever time of day it is. Welcome, everybody. All right, I think we can get going.
All right. Now that, well, I guess people will trickle in as we go. But for those new faces, you guys entered the Zoom meeting muted because we'll start the presentation with, of course, our guest, Michael Dorer, speaking. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, don't be afraid to go ahead and comment that in the chat, or there's also going to be time for Q&A at the end. But certainly if a question pops in your mind during the presentation, just drop it in the chat and we'll read those out at the end. So our guest today is a really special Montessorian. We're so excited to have him here. Michael Dorer, who is a huge name in Montessori. He holds several Montessori credentials and was trained internationally. He's taught students from age 2 to 14, and he's been involved in Montessori education for over 45 years, including 2 decades of educating adults to be Montessorians. Michael has multiple degrees, including Doctor of Education from Argosy University. After 25 years as a director of Montessori education at St. Catherine's University, he went on in 2012 to found a graduate level Montessori program in Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah, called the Institute for Montessori Innovation. In addition, since his rediscovery of storytelling as an adult, Michael has pursued the craft with appetite and delights and offering his stories insights to both children and adults. He's here today to share his presentation on storytelling and executive functioning. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Michael. Hopefully I did a good job introducing you.
I want to say thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I hope everyone is seeing a piece of African art that I have put up as sort of a placeholder that is actually about storytelling. And I put it there because I like the notion of storytelling as art, art as storytelling, and it's really just a placeholder for us. Camilla, thank you for the introduction. You said I've been 45 years in Montessori. In June of this year marked my 50th year. So what is that, your golden anniversary, I think, or something like that?
Yeah.
So, you know, it is also a label that people can put on me and say, well, now we know he's truly an antique. But I'd rather not do that. Today we're going to talk about storytelling and executive functioning. Storytelling is a particular passion of mine. When I took Montessori training, believe it or not, in 1969 and 70 for the 3 to 6, which we used to call pre-primary, one thing I loved about it was that everything is concrete. If you're going to cut a banana, there's a real banana and a real knife. If you're going to do anything, it's real. A few years later, when I went to the elementary training and eventually did that in Italy, I was shocked at the idea that we were going to talk about myth, fantasy, images, metaphor. Give me a break. I thought Montessori was all about serious, just real things. It was hard for me. But I came upon a certain moment as I was presenting things with my elementary age children. I came upon this moment where I had to do a story, supposedly. That's what my album said. So I tried it. I really didn't practice. In fact, I did a terrible job. It was very poor, and the children loved it. What does that tell me? Maybe I should actually pay attention to this and do something better. So I did. And that was the beginning of now probably 40 years of actually being a storyteller. And it was only in the last few years that I discovered its connection to executive functioning. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Storytelling and executive functioning. Let's decide, first of all, what I mean or talk about what I mean by storytelling, because if you look it up online, you'll find dozens of definitions, and many of them show people reading aloud from textbooks or picture books or other kinds of things to children. Well, storytelling, as I define it, is oral. It's not a book. It's not reading a book. It's not video. It's not a movie. It's not journalism. It's face-to-face speaking with the audience, in our case, children, the listeners, in the same room, together, using my voice, my expressions, my movement, which I can't do here because I'm limited by Zoom, but it allows for us to establish a direct human connection with the listeners. Stories aren't limited. They could be factual, they could be personal, they could be fictional, they could be make-believe or fairy tales. There are stories of all sorts, and it is a universal art. Every culture that has ever been explored by people use stories. Now, there are a lot of cultures that did not ever discover writing or reading. That's a fairly recent invention, actually, only goes back about 6,000 years, if you can call that recent. But storytelling goes back over 100,000 years. So it's kind of like it's hardwired in us, that we have this inside of us. So why do we use stories so much, and why should we use stories? Well, for one thing, they are a way that we can grasp a concept that's too big to simply try to explain, or it can't fit on the shelf. Camilla, would you go to the shelf and get me the universe? Well, no, she can't do that. But I can tell her a story about it. I can talk about it. I can bring it into metaphor and bring it to life in her mind. So this is something that we can't actually put on the shelf, but we can put into your head, into your mind, into your imagination, if you will. They also help children to develop listening. Every one of you who's a teacher knows that children who listen do better in school. I mean, that's an obvious. There was a study in Harvard a few years ago about whether or not children who listened did better. I don't know why they bothered to have a study, because it seems to me as a teacher, everyone knows that children who are good listeners do better. And of course, Montessori's idea is when you learn something in one setting, you can take that thing, that skill, that ability, and transfer it to something else. If you learn how to listen while listening to stories because they're innately attractive, you can take that skill of listening and put it into a math class, and put it into a history class, and put it into anything else in the school because you've learned listening skills. And believe it or not, stories also develop literacy. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. And you may wonder, but Michael, you just said it was oral, and literacy means writing. That's correct. But one of the core areas of literacy is comprehension. And oral comprehension, understanding and following what is said, is at the center core of all comprehension, including reading comprehension. So this begins with stories. And also there's something I call the gift of the memorable. If you think back to your own years in school, when you were a child, there are things you remember. All of us do. We remember, but we don't remember everything, do we? You don't remember every single moment. Some things stand out. Those are the memorable things. And they tend to be two kinds. One would be things that are wonderful. Something wonderful had happened. It was tremendous. The other ones that stand out are things that were terrible. The time that you were unjustly punished. The time that you were humiliated or embarrassed or something went wrong. Well, I'm going to say we can intentionally and purposefully create those memories. We can not just expect that they may happen, but we can be active in the creation of those memories, but the good kind, not the bad kind. Long ago, in these years past, when I went to school, they had corporal punishment. they hit us, and I remember very well one teacher I had who hit me with a ruler over and over. That's the kind of memory we don't want. But we can create those purposefully great memories. And you know what? Stories do that. Stories create those memories. But there's more reasons. One is stories engage the imagination in two ways. First of all, stories help to use and exercise the imagination. And the other way is they develop the imagination. Imagination is at the basis of creativity. Creativity is at the basis of innovation. So if we want innovation and creativity, the place to work is on imagination. And what better way than stories? That's exactly what they do. Another reason, and one that we need to mention, is children love stories. They're innately attractive. There's something in stories that appeal to children. Now, if we can develop literacy, and we can develop imagination, and we can create attentiveness and listening skills, and we can also probably develop better understanding of many concepts in a way that children love, why not do it? Why shouldn't that be part of every classroom, whether it's Montessori or not? Every classroom, everywhere. And there's one more reason, and this is what we're going to talk about today. Yes, I will get here. Executive functioning. What is that? Well, we're going to come back to it. I want to say a few more words about stories because I think that the whole idea of stories is misunderstood. It's misunderstood, and you can find that out if you simply look online. That if you look up storytelling on Google and hit images, almost all of them show people reading from books. Reading from books is a wonderful activity, but it's not storytelling. It's a different activity. It's a different art. Here's one thing that I didn't know when I started storytelling, and I had no intent. Seriously, it's a spiritual act. It enriches the spirit of the children, of course, but also the teller. When I tell a story, my spirit is elevated. And it is a collaborative act because you can't tell a story successfully. I mean, you can say words aloud, but it's really not storytelling unless there are listeners. So it means that the listener and the teller are part of something that raises both of their spirits to a new level. And that's pretty potent. That's pretty powerful. It opens our minds in ways that, well, art does. And storytelling is an art. And it's an art like so many arts, except this one is accessible to everybody. You can be a story. Maybe you have a hard time painting. Maybe you have a difficulty conceiving of yourself as a sculptor. Perhaps you don't see yourself as a designer or some other kind of art. But storytelling is in all of us. It's there for all of us to access. There are at least, in a book I wrote called The Deep Well of Time, I identified 7 major kinds of stories. Great lessons, curriculum stories, creative dramatics, biographical histories, personal stories, character development, and origins. A lot of these overlap, which is why I use this graphic, because an origin story could also be a great lesson. Biographical history means a biography of someone other than yourself, like Maria Montessori, where a personal story is really a biographical story about your own, an incident or set of incidents in your own life. So these overlap quite a bit. What we're going to focus on, to a great extent, what brought me into this area so dramatically years ago, are curriculum stories. Curriculum stories are a special kind of story we use in Montessori. And actually, I don't know of other educational systems that use this. This is presenting something like math facts, history, grammar, biology, biological classification, you name it. It's presenting something that is a curriculum component using a story. Embedding that particular curriculum component metaphorically in a story component, making it something, well, that might be more accessible and digestible in a different way to many of our children. A curriculum story is like a gift. You're really giving the children something wonderful when you do this. Remember the gift of the memorable. This is what you're doing. You're giving them a gift, and many, maybe most stories in Montessori are curricular stories. All of us have been to school. All of us went to elementary school. Did you have these in your schooling when you were a child? My guess is, unless you were in Montessori, no. That this is something, maybe in Waldorf, they are also good storytellers. And I've learned a lot from Waldorf teachers that I've studied with. But these areas, like arithmetic, biology, geography, geometry, history, language, or the arts, all can have curriculum stories that really enrich them. Now let's turn, and I promised you I would, let's turn to executive functioning. Now I think I've described what stories are and what I mean by stories. And our topic today has to do with, well, is there a connection between storytelling and executive functioning? And of course, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think there was. There is, in fact, a strong connection. But what is it? What do I mean by executive functioning anyway? Executive functioning refers to some essential skills that must be in place for children to be successful in school. We employ them, we use them at all ages. You use them as adults, children use them. It's used throughout adulthood. And there are three main skills that I want to focus on. One is called working memory. This is the first of three key executive functioning skills. The second is called cognitive flexibility. And the third is called inhibition control. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about each one of these. So I'll explain what they mean. But I want you to hold in your mind that there are other skills too, but these three are premier and need to be thought about. Working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibition control. That's sometimes called inhibitory control. Working memory, cognitive flexibility, sometimes called mental flexibility. And I put this little Venn diagram in to show, again, like the various kinds of stories, these overlap. And one informs the other in positive ways. If you want to be successful in school or in life, you are employing these skills, whether you know it or not. You are using these skills. These skills lead to advanced thinking, playing with ideas, planning, being thoughtful, meeting things in your life that are not expected, that are unexpected, or that are challenges. They lead to perseverance. They lead to resisting temptation, which is hard for all of us. They lead to developing stick-to-itiveness, which is a very, very important skill for kids and for us, and to maintaining focus. Wow. Now that is a shopping list of good things. That shows some things that I wish we all could accomplish, and we can by implementing our executive functioning skills. And here's the good news. You aren't born with a limited, fixed set of executive functioning skills. This was once thought to be true. What you get is what you were born with. But what we know now is what you were born with can be enhanced, can be nurtured, can be developed, can be brought to a new level. So if there are ways that we can implement things that can actually develop and grow these skills, we should be using them. Because in fact, we can develop and grow these skills among the children with whom we work. it can actually be done. And that's what we're going to talk about, because I think storytelling is one of the prime ways that we can do exactly that. Storytelling directly addresses each one of these. We're going to need to talk about how that happens, because it's really important to realize what storytelling does. Storytelling, some people think, well, I don't have time for it. It's the icing on the cake. It's the extra thing that I can't fit into the classroom because of my didactic requirements. I have to teach math. I have to teach language. I have to outfit children for the test. Well, maybe that's true. But I'll tell you what, you don't have time not to tell stories in the classroom, because it is the act of storytelling that grows their understanding and learning and these three skills of executive functioning. Ignoring it ignores one of the most significant ways that humans have communicated to each other for millennia. I'm proud to say, some people kind of laugh at this, I'm proud to say I am a traditional teacher. You'll hear Montessorians say, well, what's the difference between Montessori and traditional teachers? And they're talking about the kind of schools that have whiteboards, that have computers, that have iPads, that have desks, that have, well, you know what schools are like. But that's not traditional. That's been invented in the last century or so. What is traditional goes back 100,000 years, before there was writing, before there were desks, and for goodness sake, before there was anything electronic. And that is oral communication. That's how knowledge was transmitted for most of human history. So if you're going to do that, you are a traditionalist. Welcome. I am too. And I think that hooking on to tradition of that sort means we're hooking onto the inner nature of kids, the inner nature of people, for that matter. Let's talk about each one of these now. I told you there were three big skills. The first one is working memory, and that means our everyday memory that we think of. For instance, I remembered today that I was supposed to get online here at 12:25 with Camilla. And will I remember that next year or 5 years from now? Probably not. Will I remember my shopping list? Will I remember what the price of gas was when I took the car to the filling station? Probably not. But you remember that for a while, and that's working memory. Sometimes people call it short-term memory, but it is employed by us all the time with things we do all the time. I put my food on the stove to cook. It's supposed to be done in 25 minutes. It would be good if in 25 minutes I remembered that instead of tomorrow, and tomorrow it's burned black. No, short-term working memory. That allows us to hold information briefly in our mind. And the thing is, when necessary, we transfer it into long-term memory. We have a filter. I'm not going to transfer my today's grocery shopping list into long-term memory. But there are things that we do transfer into long-term memory. And here's the thing. Most kids who have learning differences, who have challenges, have trouble with exactly this, with working memory. So if we could actually, and I already told you, we can actually improve these areas, we could actually improve the reaction of children who have these difficulties. It is important to us with working memory to be able to do any everyday task. Just as I said, I had to know what time it is. I had to come up here. I had to be sure that I had made prior plans so my dog, who loves to come with me, wouldn't be up here in case she began barking in the middle of our meeting today. It allows me to make plans. It allows me to execute plans. It allows me to do what needs to be done without filling up my memory forever with otherwise insignificant tasks. So, I already think I said some of this. Whenever we rely on doing something immediate and important, well, that's what we use is working memory. You hold something in your mind and you apply it to different scenarios. Now, to improve it, here's the thing. Researchers say we can use what they call a elaborative rehearsal. That means we recognize significance of something, some important piece of information or some event. And then we associate that with other things. So mnemonics would be a good example of using elaborative rehearsal. In stories, we're going to see how we connect what's in the story, and we use that elaborative rehearsal that feeds into our working memory and then can go into our long-term memory, because the more we use this, the more pieces we filter out that are essential or that seemed essential to us that go into our long-term memory. It moves information from working memory into long-term memory. And that's really important for learners. Look at something as simple as mathematics facts. What is 7 plus 5? Well, maybe at one point that's just in our working memory, but ultimately we put that, I hope, into our long-term memory so we're able to access it. But first, we have ways that we practice it. Storytelling. All right, how does storytelling fit into this? Well, it gives us a lot of opportunities for elaborative rehearsal. There often are little impressions that are connected to pictures in the story, mental pictures that we can recall, and they go into long-term memory. Stories create an image in the person's mind that's accessible from working memory. Now, I reference here a story I wrote called The Four Strange Brothers. And if you have this book, The Deep Well of Time, that's a story that's in there. And it's a story that personifies or addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division as people, as brothers, four strange brothers. Children have come to me years later. Children in their 20s, 30s, 40s, that dates me, doesn't it? Or even their 50s, who say, Mr. Dorer, I remember those brothers. I love the one who was division because he was generous and always wanted to share things out equally. What caused that memory to be there? It's because it was embedded in a story. Whereas if I just gave a lesson, the chances of that recall are diminished. But if there's something with which they can use elaborative rehearsal, connect it to an image, then it's going to stick. And I think that's really important because these kinds of stories provide what I call a memory hook. They provide another way to access or hook ourselves into memory in the long term. And the development and accessing of memory is essential to our executive functioning and in fact to our life. One of the most important characteristics of storytelling is repetition. There's a story I tell in which I say, well, it's actually the four strange brothers. They all dress in, first of all, I talk about their hat, their shirt, their pants, their shoes, and I gesture as I go through all of that. And I say that over and over because they're four brothers, so in each one, we repeat those steps. Repetition is basic to many, many stories, including traditional stories, and that allows the listener to follow the story and utilize their working memory to actually see where the story is going before we get there, to actually make predictive hypotheses about where it's going to go. They're using repetition to inform their memory. It sets up a series of signs or guideposts. And then the children, when they're asked to retell the story, which I think is important, when they're asked to be able to tell the story, they have these guideposts. They have this mental structure. Pattern repetition means going through the same thing repeatedly. There's word repetition and there's pattern repetition. If you think of a story that I hope you know, like The Little Red Hen, the little red hen repeatedly, over and over in repetition, and this is why we remember it. She asks her friends to help her plant the wheat, to help her grow it, to help her harvest it, to help her grind it, to help her cook bread eventually. And the answer is no, 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 until we get to the very end and they're all willing to help her eat it. Well, why do I remember that story? It's the repetition that makes it there. Stone Soup is another good example that I mentioned here, where a group of soldiers comes to a small town and they have a rock, a stone. And one after another, villagers come up at their request and contribute some carrots, some potatoes, a piece of meat, a soup bone, whatever. But this is repeated over and over until eventually they have a delicious soup. This kind of repetition gives a framework, gives a structure to which we can apply our memory, and then we recall because of the repetition that is embedded within the story. Now there's another kind of repetition, and that's called the rule of three. Three things are really important in stories. Like, think of the Three Little Pigs. First pig built the house of straw, no good. Second pig built the house of sticks, no good. But guess what? If you know the rule of three, you know that almost certainly that third one is going to succeed. And often the first one or two look like they're favored, that they would be the winners in a situation like this. But eventually the third one emerges as successful. This goes through all sorts of folk tales, all sorts of fairy tales, and many of the stories I've written use the rule of three because it allows children to be predictive, to say, that's interesting, but now this person who was so overlooked in a story like Measuring the Farm, I talk about there were three children. The first one, very strong, known as Strong Arms. Oh, he's so powerful. The second one, Strong Hands, very powerful. And then there's a small girl that is of little consequence. You already know she's going to be the hero. She's going to be the one that's going to actually have the most consequence, because you know the rule of three means almost certainly we've overlooked something really important with her. So let's pay attention to that. And that's what this does to us. These are tools that enhance our memory, that enhance our using of our memory and our implementing it. And remember, I said you can develop your working memory. Well, this is how it's done. This is how to do it. I mentioned here the Three Little Pigs. Goldilocks is another one, the Three Bears. And of course, Goldilocks herself, when she's she's kind of a burglar, but when she's in the house, she does first one thing, then another, and the third thing is she gets into bed upstairs, and that's where the three bears discover her. The Fool of the World is an interesting Russian folktale, and again, it's about a farmer who has three sons. The first two are very skillful, a third is a fool. All right, you already know that guy is going to succeed. That's how folktales work. And I mentioned Measuring the Farm in my book, The Deep Well of Time, uses that same scheme. So when you become familiar with this, and this is a really important thing, you can make predictions. You can enhance your memory usage because of this. And then when it's revealed that you were right, that in fact, that third pig did build the house of bricks and did succeed, that third son wasn't a fool after all, or that daughter of the old farmer was in fact the hero of the whole story, as you had thought or anticipated, then you become more skilled at the making of hypotheses, using your memory to implement it in interpreting events. This is talked about a lot by an interesting guy named Brian Boyd, who wrote a book called The Origin of Stories, which I suggest to you. It talks a lot about, among other things, the rule of three. Here's a quote from him. I like it. I hope you do too. Minds exist to predict what will happen next. They mine the present for clues they refine with help from the past to anticipate the immediate future. What an interesting idea. Minds exist to predict what will happen next. You might be thinking, well, where's Michael going to go with this? You are trying to predict what comes next. And I might think, what will you do with my ideas that I put forward today? I'm doing the same thing. And we do that all the time, don't we? So that, by the way, is the cover of his book down there in the corner on the origin of stories. Minds exist to predict what will happen next. I really like that idea. I already spoke briefly about the gift of the memorable, and I don't want you to forget it. That stories also create these moments that go into long-term memory that we can access, that create signposts along our life, that help us to understand what has happened and put it into context. That is short-term memory or working memory transitioning itself into long-term or more permanent memory. Really, according to Montessori, there are three kinds of memory. One is called nemi, which is oddly spelled M-N-E-M-E, and is named after a Greek goddess. And that is the kind of remembering that babies have, where you know you lived as a 1-year-old, as a 3-month-old, but you don't necessarily recall those things, but they're put somewhere in your mind. There's some place in there, and what she called that is nemi. We're more concerned as we get with older children with the other two kinds, the short-term or working memory and the long-term. And so Montessori does say at around the time that they leave the first plane of development and enter the second plane of development, nemi is abandoned. It's still there in us somewhere though. And sometimes it's stimulated and you have a moment where you sort of recall something that happened when you were an infant. Well, as we get older, we develop that into the short and long-term memory, which we can use in school. And that memorable moment can be embedded in our life forever. What happened to me here? There we go. Now, another thing about stories is oral comprehension, and I mentioned that. Oral, meaning words, precedes written comprehension. It's an essential precursor. If I can comprehend the story and tell you back, who were the characters in the Three Little Pigs? Who were the most important characters in my story of the builder, the measurer, those three skills that are so important in the calculator, the builder, the measurer, and the calculator? What were they about? And you can tell that back. You are comprehending the story. What do you think was the most important thing that happened in Goldilocks? What struck you in this story that you may have had about Little Red Riding Hood? What really stands up? Well, that kind of thing is comprehension. Teachers want children to comprehend what they've what they've read, excuse me. Well, of course. In fact, there's sort of a widespread concern that children nowadays are much more frequently able to read words without knowing or remembering what was said. Comprehension is lacking. And some people say Montessori doesn't do enough for that. Well, let's tell stories. And that will be how we can do something with that. Now I'm going to turn to the next point, cognitive flexibility. That means being adaptable in your thinking, being able to be responsive, being able to think outside the box, as people often say, or throw the box away for that matter, to be thinking in a new, different, and responsive way. It includes being able to reevaluate ideas, to change ideas, to embrace new and unusual ideas. Camilla told you earlier that I started a program called the Center for Montessori Innovation. Yeah, innovation sometimes means re-examining all of the preconceived notions that we may have, some of which I should say, we may hold sacred. but maybe they need to be looked at anyway. And when we do that and we look at challenging these notions, we're using cognitive flexibility. Humans are pretty good at this. We're good at rethinking things. We can stick with strategies and ways to behave as long as they seem to work really well, but we're capable of reevaluating and changing those if the need for change becomes evident to us. Unfortunately, cognitive flexibility goes down with age, but it doesn't have to. So research shows that while older people are frequently unable to adapt to new situations and environments, it doesn't have to be that way. Because by working with cognitive flexibility, we can maintain it in a high way. Again, stories help cognitive flexibility. And they help through something called metaphorical thinking. Thinking in metaphors, thinking in images, thinking in archetypes or representations of different sorts. When we talk about something like courage, and that is embodied in a story as a metaphor, as in Jonathan Wolfe's story of the 3 roses, when we think of this image, it's a metaphor. The story may be about courage, but that word is not specifically mentioned specifically in the story. But we can hold that in our mind, and we can understand and take ourselves into that place. Listen, this is really important, that when you hear a story, you can let go of what's going on in everyday life. And you can immerse yourself in this, well, you may think of it as unreality, but in fact it is a reality. It's a reality metaphorically in your mind. If you've gone to a movie and broke into tears because of what's happened there, you're not sitting back thinking, oh, but that's just a bunch of flickering images on a screen. You lose yourself in it. You buy into that. That's an amazing ability that we have. And we can do that in fiction, fantasy, movies, novels, and oral stories as well. Metaphorical thinking is at the center, the heart of storytelling. It is the basis of successful storytelling. When listeners hear stories like this, they respond in 2 ways. They respond emotionally. I mentioned tears a while ago, but it might be laughter, it might be smiles, it might be knowing understanding. They react emotionally and also cognitively. Samuel Taylor Coleridge said, he called this the willing suspension of disbelief. You let go of your disbelief and allow yourself into the moment. The last of the 3 I want to talk about is inhibition control, sometimes called inhibitory control or response inhibition. Inhibition control means you can say no to things you'd like to say yes to. It's, as they say here, say no to the brownie skill. Well, that looks pretty good to me, but I'm going to say no. It's our ability to put off immediate gratification. Now, this is not a uniquely human skill. I have a dog, I mentioned her a while ago, and when she comes in, she wants to eat her breakfast or her supper. When she comes in, and we're putting it in the bowl, she knows she has to sit there and wait. And then I say, okay, Whisper, you can eat. She can use that inhibition control. Well, if a dog can do it, I know darn well that we can all do it. It means we don't give in to the moment. We use willpower. We use restraint. We use self-control. This is essential to everything, and it affects our everyday life. And by the way, the lack of inhibition control is a feature of a lot of psychiatric disorders. I'm not saying that a lack of inhibition control means a psychiatric disorder, but good, healthy thinking includes inhibition control. Like I said, it means not getting what you want immediately, but to be patient. It means you have to plan. You have to have forethought. This is at the core of what we call in Montessori grace and courtesy. We're teaching children how not to put themselves in the forefront, their immediate need of everything, but how to respect others. Maybe I need to listen to you instead of interrupting you. I need to pay attention to what you're doing. I need to shake your hand politely instead of brushing you off. It stops us from making fools of ourselves, which we are also relatively good at. Well, what about stories? Story listeners need to be in control. They need to sit there to hear the story. They can't jump up in the middle of the story and shout out, because that ruins the story. They can't make gestures that inhibit or interfere with others. They need to control their impulse for questions that are coming out all the time, but in fact, wait until the story reaches its conclusion of some sort. They also need to be cognitively flexible because they have to go into the story and then exert inhibitory control so they don't damage the story or the discussion process. How do I do that with kids? I only have 2 rules for stories. 2. That's an easy number to remember. The first one is simply stay quiet. No questions, no hands up, no whispering, quiet. And the second rule, keep your hands and your bodies to yourself. No touching, poking, high-fiving, or anything like that. And amazingly, I've successfully told stories with toddlers through teens. By the way, those are the 2 toughest groups that I've told stories with. And they're not that different after all. But I've told stories for toddlers through teens and lots of kids in between. And eventually, maybe not the first time, but eventually these 2 rules work. Why? Why do they work? Because the stories are intrinsically rewarding and the kids want to hear them. They don't want me to stop because the rule has been broken. They don't want to stop. They don't want to have the person next to them interrupt the story. They share with each other a mutual support for these rules because the stories are intrinsically important. Okay, let's put this all together, what I've been saying, and wrap it up. Working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibition control are essential, but they're not limited to storytelling. Why do I talk about storytelling? Because it's there for all of us to access right now. If you can master these skills, any one or all of them, through storytelling, then they can be transferred to other areas in the classroom. We can take that skill of cognitive flexibility. We can take our working memory abilities. We can take our ability for inhibitory control and use it, well, anywhere in the classroom or life. That's the transferability that Montessori really pushes. That's why we work with something like the cylinder blocks in the 3 to 6 class. And you think, is all that they're learning how to put a cylinder into a hole? I mean, is that the limit of their learning? No, they're transferring those concepts of size into the rest of life. And that's what we're good at. So when we are good at learning these skills through storytelling, we have now the ability to transfer them to everything else. There's the power. There we go. What happens is these simply become habits of mind. It's just habitual to control oneself, for example, and not burst out. It becomes habitual to look at alternatives, that's cognitive flexibility, and weigh different possibilities. It becomes habitual to put things into our short-term memory. And they consistently produce results, which means they are reinforced for us over and over, starting with a story, then working through the rest of life with them. So my summary, I want to say a few things. These are what I tried to emphasize with you. First of all, storytelling. Even if it didn't do these things, it does so much that it has a place in the classroom. In every classroom. As I said before, toddlers through teens. For that matter, I think it has a place in adult teacher education or any adult education too. And adults, really, I've been in teacher education for many years, and those adults also come back and say, oh, Michael, I remember that story that we did about this or that or the other thing, because our training program is so imbued with stories. Oh, I remember using this story or that story. Those stories have started with their short-term memory and entered their long-term memory. I also wanted to talk with you today about three major components of executive functioning, and I hope you have a handle on them. The first was working memory, sometimes called short-term memory, the memory we use every day that I hope you're using right now to remember what we just talked about a few minutes ago. That would be working memory. Cognitive flexibility, meaning we have that ability to engage with new ideas, to challenge that which we already believe, to think as if there were no bugs. And then inhibitory control, self-control, the ability to be patient, to wait and understand, to think about things before we act. These things are at the core of what I hope I communicated with you today, and that I hope that we shared well today. A lot of the references I made were from this book that I wrote, The Deep Well of Time. That's a book about storytelling and why storytelling is good in the classroom. And it has about 50 stories as examples in it. I hope you've all read it. Of course, you may not have, but you can get it from a place called Parent Child Press here in the USA. And you can also get it from Amazon. And if you're not in the US, it's probably better to get it from Amazon because they're good at shipping. They are very good at that. And this is the book I showed you earlier, The Deep Well of Time. I hope you have it and will read it. So now let's turn to questions. I think that I've said a lot of things, and probably, I'm betting there are a few things in the chat area where there are some questions that people want answered. So Camilla, do you have some that you can share with me?
Yes, so Tina Patel made a question about working memory. She said working memory is also useful for people with dementia. Can you please expand on that?
Well, it is. It is very useful for dementia. In fact, nowadays, there's a whole movement of working with Montessori, practical life and sensorial materials in particular with elders who are suffering from dementia and using storytelling as well. So that's a terrible disease, like Alzheimer's, is a horrible thing. And anything we can do to help with that is really wonderful. Often with elders who are suffering from dementia, long-term memory images are still present. They may remember songs that they knew when they were children, but not what happened yesterday. And so anything that we can do that enhances short-term memory, short-term recall is wonderful. It's not that I'm not saying storytelling cures Alzheimer's, that would be absurd. But storytelling addresses one of the key issues that can be present with people who are suffering from dementia. And it is a pleasant way to help encourage short-term memory.
All right, another comment from Matt Hilton who says, we have multiple copies at our school, love it. I think it was to one of the books that you mentioned there.
That's not a question, but I love it. Thank you.
I don't know, we don't have any more in the chat, so I don't know if anybody wants to ask a question now that we're turning to the audience a bit, or had any thoughts or comments. Yes, Kathleen, I see your hand.
What a treat this was for me, Michael. I've been following you for years, but never have heard you speak. And so this was just, I wish I had taken my elementary training from you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, you've given me some ideas about handling staff members.
Really?
May not be exactly where we would like to be in the second and third kinds of memories. I mean, of executive functioning, the being locked in to their point of view, and not being able to change. I can't find my notes, but there were two of them there that just screamed at me. And so I didn't know if you've ever helped schools with staff relations when there are problems among staff.
I do. And I do a lot of school consultation. People only call me as a consultant, frankly, if they have issues. They don't call me and say, we have a wonderful school and we'd like you to come and tell us so. They call me, and all consultants probably, when they have perceived that there's something that needs to be addressed. Look, here's the fact. We've all had Montessori. Well, most of us have had Montessori training. I've had 4 different trainings I've sat through, and each one of those trainings produces albums, memories, and so on. Even so, one of the things I don't want to hear from staff is, oh, well, in my training, it was blah, blah, blah. In my training, it was such and such. Give it up. We need to move to what's needed now. And we have to sometimes, that's the cognitive flexibility. That's the ability to say, well, it was this way in my album, but I need to make some adjustments.
Right.
I need to grow. I need to do some new things. And you know what? That's hard for a lot of Montessori folks, I found out.
It is.
And I know it was hard for me. I'm not going to brag that I was always cognitively flexible, hardly. And I probably still have some of those blocks in the road, but at least I try to avoid them. And I think when we hear that, and when I hear that with staff, that I go to a school and they say, oh, well, but Michael, in my training, I don't ever want to hear that again, quite honestly.
Thank you.
Camilla, I see Mary Lou's got her hand up.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Michael. I loved everything you had to say. I'm just wondering if you see the way I do an increase in executive functioning difficulties in our children today. Personally, I do see more of that. And I'm wondering if you see it as well in schools. And if so, do you have any thoughts as to why we're seeing a little bit more of this situation?
If I see would you say that first question, if I see the value of?
Not the value. I'm seeing more children with executive functioning skills. Difficult. That's what I don't know whether it's, I'm so old that I can remember television. We used to say, Michael, remember, please limit your child's time on television. Well, now they've got the distractions of the computers and so on. But I do see a lot of children who have difficulty just organizing and knowing the steps of things, starting something and going from the beginning, the middle, and the end. Do you see this? And if so, do you think, what reasons do you think are behind it?
I do see this. I think, by the way, Mary Lou, it's been a long time since we were together and I was out there and had the opportunity to tour your school, a memory that has now gone into my long-term memory. Yeah, I'm really glad that I had that opportunity. But to your question, yes, I do see this. And I think that there are several things that I would point to. One is the images that we are fed that are already preformed for us, that don't encourage children to develop images on their own. For example, if I asked you all, and I'm not going to make you say this, but if I asked you all, what does Snow White look like? How is she dressed? Well, it turns out, and research has been done on this, nearly everybody describes her to a T as she was in the Disney movie. Why? Because that is an image that someone else created that has gone into our mind. If we can emphasize stories without images, where you have to create your own, you're on the step to cognitive flexibility. You're on the step to being able to do that which you just said you're seeing a lack of. We need to stop spoon feeding kids is basically what it is with so many of these images, and many of them are indeed connected to screen time. You're right. It's not just that I'm so aged that I didn't have a TV in my house when I was young, until I do remember when we got one. But when I read that toddlers spend about 30 hours a week in screen time today on average, that's 3/4 of a full-time job. What is happening mentally with the result of that? Problem is we don't yet know, because they haven't yet to, we have yet to measure what it will be like as they age and grow up. But what you're seeing isn't good. And connected with that is the iPhone, or just the cell phone in general. And I know that as a university professor, we've had to deal a lot with young people coming into the university who don't know how to communicate. I mean, just talk, to have a conversation, to enter into discussion face to face, put the phone down and enter into a discussion face to face. I consider that serious. I think that's not something, frankly, that needs to be addressed with university freshmen, or in my case, graduate students. It's something we need to address when they're 5 years old, when they're 3 years old, when they're 12 years old. That's when the mind is at its most flexible and developing. And that's when we should be dealing with, for example, I think in elementary Montessori, continual higher order thinking discussions that cause us to have to think at a new level, and not just the kind of discussion I've seen too often, which isn't a discussion, but it's simply questions with a simple, straightforward yes or no answer. That's not thinking. Anyway, that's my pulpit time for the day.
Thank you. I agree, Michael. Thank you.
You're quite welcome, Mary Lou.
We have another question, Michael, from Matt Hilton asking, do you have any other storytelling resources to recommend, a follow-up to The Deep Well of Time, perhaps?
More and more nowadays, I'm seeing Montessori conferences that have components of storytelling there, and you can pick those up. The American Montessori Society also has a set of webinars that, if you're an AMS member, I think they're free. If you're not an AMS member, I think you have to pay for them, not that much. But I know there are at least 2 of them that are on storytelling. One is on math storytelling, and the other is on just the value of storytelling in general. And I've listened to both of them, and I find them interesting. Anything written by Kieran Egan, if you can find anything by Kieran Egan, he is a professor, I believe, at Simon Fraser University in Canada. Wonderful, wonderful, thoughtful work about storytelling, imagery, and metaphor that just is really excellent. And if you look at, I'm just looking at a book right now called Imagination First. And that is Imagination First. I'm looking at it on my shelf. Imagination First, The Power of Possibility. And I can't recall the authors, but Imagination First. And it's not about storytelling specifically, but it's about the development of imagination, which after all is at the heart of storytelling and the arts in general. I think that we want the imaginative teacher. We want the imaginative teacher education program. We want the imaginative school. And we want imagination to imbue what it is that we do in school. Because as I said earlier, from that comes creativity. From that comes innovation. From that comes all human progress. So those are some suggestions.
Can I just follow up on what you said when you answered Mary Lou? I remembered the music that was on, okay, let me go back. In high school, I can remember where I was, what I was feeling, who I was with, my boyfriend, put your head on my shoulders, you know, and then and whatever the music videos started happening, probably in the 70s or 80s or whatever. And I had the very same thought. This is robbing people of hearing a song and imagining, you know, where they were and what they were doing. Now we have those images fed to us. Some of them are awful. So it's a shame. It's just, it works against what we're, you know, trying to do.
Thank you for that comment. That's very cogent. Camilla, are there other thoughts or questions?
No other questions in the chat. Dolores Vasquez commented, I love about cognitive flexibility, being flexible and able to collaborate with each other with openness. I think we can all agree on that. It's important to have that. Any other questions that you can unmute yourself. Christine Parsons says, thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Christine. Oh, I should say also that I sent this PowerPoint in a PDF format to Camilla, and you'll be able to access, I think they'll be able to access that, correct?
Yes, that's correct. All the information on the slides will be accessible. You shared the PDF, so all of the slides, if anyone wants to reference information on them, they'll be able to.
So I hope that if you'd like to, that you take advantage of that. And I do want to show you, may I show them one more book?
Yes, sure.
I also want to show you this one, which I'm proud of. This is called Hatching the Cosmic Egg. And it's a book for children that I wrote. It's kind of a new thing for me, trying to write a children's book where I was in collaboration with an artist. And I'm used to kind of having total control of what I write. But when you're working with an artist, with another person, well, that required cognitive flexibility. And I had to be able to respond to her desires, her wants, her artistic vision. And it produced this book that I hope that it was aimed at 5 to 10-year-old children, but I've learned that people have used it outside that. And one thing I'll say, if you get the book, I'm a storyteller. So the book, I believe, is best read aloud. I like the sound of the voice rather than, when you get it, don't just sit as you would typically as an adult and quietly read it to yourself silently. No. Lose your embarrassment and just read it aloud to yourself and let the sound penetrate. I think that's helpful. Anyway, if you want to contact me, on the slides that are there is my contact information. I will say I do get a very large number of emails every day. And if I miss one, the next day it's buried. And so if you write to me and I don't get back to you, that also is my phone number. Go ahead and give me a text and say, hey, Michael, I wrote you something and you haven't gotten back to me, and it's harder for me to ignore the text. So then I have to go back and look it up. I do want to get to you. If you just write to me and say, I liked your presentation, I may not respond. And if you give me a very, very detailed situation of your school and you want me to solve the problem, I may not be able to do that without coming there. But in general, I want to respond. I want to have a communication with you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And Kathleen says, Michael, would you come to our school and give the same presentation once the pandemic in Florida settles down?
Yeah, of course. I'll be in Florida, in fact, for the Montessori Foundation's conference in November. So maybe we can extend the stay down here a little bit and I can get to your school. That's in Sarasota, but once I'm in Florida, I can go to wherever.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, your wonderful presentation, and for sharing your wisdom with us all, Michael. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye, everyone.